So today we're going to make another useless Soulsborne ranking video, going over all of the katanas, ranking them from worst to best. Now yes, it's just going to include the relevant From Software games, not going to include the older ones. I haven't played them, don't really care to play them either. Now the criteria for this list, as always, it's just going to be for PvE, and it's going to be based on how useful the weapon is in its own game. I'm not going to really try and blur the lines between the games, otherwise all the Elden Ring katanas will just get very high on the list because they just typically get higher damage values, you get more buffs, you get things like OP weapon skills. So for instance, if there's going to be a katana that's like a top 5% weapon in that game, it's going to be higher on the list. If there's a katana that's like a top 20% weapon in the game, it's going to get lower on the list. Which honestly, like all the katanas are very good. There's like not a single bad katana out there. Probably the most consistent weapon class across all the games. They always have really good range, good movesets, nice speeds, good damage. They're definitely the poster boy of dexterity. But yeah, with that out the way, let's just get started. Starting off right at the bottom, we have the Meteoric Ore Blade, which is definitely the most useless katana in the entire series. The only reason you would ever really want to use it is because you think it looks cool, but unfortunately that is not going to save it today, because to start off with, this is going to be the shortest katana in the entire game, and even despite the range, it's still the heaviest katana in the game. Its damage isn't even that good. You only get C scalings in strength and intelligence. It does split magic damage, so therefore it has to compete with the Moonveil katana, of which that one is obviously going to be better. It's not even that good of an option to power stance with the Moonveil katana, because one is a strength-based weapon, the other one's dexterity-based. If you actually want to power stance with the Moonveil, you're better off going with like a magic-infused Nagakiba or Uchi katana, because it's going to get better scalings, better damage, more range, and arguably have the better moveset too, which like the only unique thing about the Meteoric Ore Blade is going to be its unique heavy attack, which is reminiscent of the Ichimonji combat art from Sekiro. It has those nice downward lunging attacks, does actually cover some nice distances, but do you know what else actually covers some really nice range and potentially just do more damage too? A poking attack. You can get poking attacks with your heavy with all the other katanas, and poking attacks are just amazing in every single game. So the fact that you're just losing access to a standstill poking attack is not that good, especially if you're going to replace it with a vertical chop, which your light attack combo already gets vertical swipes, so why would I really want another one? And also the heavy attack doesn't even do more stance damage. I wish it did. It would have been actually pretty cool, but it gets just as much stance damage as all the other heavy attacks for the katanas. Now most of the other katanas when two-handed does actually have vertical chops with its heavy attack, so with the two-handed moveset I'd probably rather have the Meteoric Ore Blade over the Uchi katana, but I'd still would never really want to pick the Meteoric Ore Blade over it because this weapon's skill is Gravitas, which one is like very situational and borderline trash, and two, it's not even a unique skill. It's an Ash of War that can be equipped on other weapons, and being that this thing can't be infused, you just get stuck with it. So if you literally want a better version of the Meteoric Ore Blade, you just go with like a magic infused Gravitas based Uchi katana, and you could just get more damage and more range. Or better yet, actually put a good Ash of War on the katana, and it could be way better than that. And then it's like not even close. Number 32, we have the Dark Souls 2 Dark Drift. Now, katanas in Dark Souls 2 are very interesting. They're actually the only katanas in the entire series that actually don't get bleed, which I guess is not too big of a downside because bleed in this game kind of just sucks. But I guess their trade-off is that they actually get very high counter damage in this game, which is obviously extremely useful. Now, for the Dark Drift in particular, this thing actually can get some of the highest base damage, even like somewhat comparable to like a Chaos Blade with a Dexterity infusion. It also is the lightest katana, and it also does have like shield piercing effects because it does have like that translucent, like partially invisible look to it, which in a PvE setting, it's going to be more of a detriment than anything. And just doing partial damage through shields with a heavy attack isn't going to be that useful because there's not many shielded enemies in this game. But unfortunately, this thing just has way too many downsides. Starting off with that, it actually has some of the worst reach out of all the katanas. It also gets the lowest counter damage in the entire class at 130. Most other katanas get 150 counter damage. It also gets the lowest amount of poise damage too at 15, where all the other katanas have at least 20 poise damage. It also does get the lowest amount of durability as well at 20. And as for its moveset, it's arguably just like one of the worst movesets for the katanas too. The one-handed is very similar to the Uchi katana, except the follow-up heavy attack is just like a slightly bit slower for some reason. And the two-handed moveset actually does have a different follow-up heavy attack. It goes from a horizontal swipe to like a downward swipe, which vertical swipes I'm just never going to value with a heavy attack, which honestly is just going to be a common theme throughout this video. I already get vertical swipes with a light attack combo. Why would I want it with my heavy? I'd much rather just have variety with horizontal and poking attacks. Poking attacks especially because you can just get more range and just get more damage too. So despite this weapon actually getting some nice damage and having some shield piercing effects, it's not going to be that useful in my opinion. Number 31, we have the Dark Souls 3 Dark Drift. Now, as I just talked about with the Dark Souls 2 version, gonna be basically the exact same thing. It's very light, has very bad range. The base damage is actually pretty high, although in this game it actually gets pretty bad scalings. So actually can be outclassed in the damage department with a lot of other katanas, but it also does get that translucent effect to where you can't really see it as kind of invisible, which I guess is only going to be useful for PvP, but you can just like buff the weapon to counteract it, so it doesn't really make much of a difference. But yes, it does actually get the same shield piercing effect with its heavy attack, and it does get it with the weapon skill too. In fact, the weapon skill actually does 100% damage through shields, which is obviously going to be very situational. And honestly, kicking a shield is arguably just better to do than just using a weapon skill anyway. Now, the weapon art itself is not that bad. It's a nice poking attack. You might recognize it as Impaling Thrust from Elden Ring, but honestly, I would just rather have the regular weapon arts that the other katanas get in Hold, because that is offer more variety with the moveset and like a nice horizontal swipe, and they could just do more damage for less FP. So yeah, the same as a Dark Souls 2 Dark Drift, it's more of just like a gimmicky type of weapon that doesn't really have much going for it. Number 31, we have the Berserker Blade from Dark Souls 2. Now, this is not actually a bad weapon at all. It's still very serviceable as a nice katana throughout most of the game. This thing actually does get the highest amount of base damage out of all the other katanas, but the trade-off being is that it gets tied for the worst amount of range, and it gets some pretty poor scalings. It's the only katana that actually doesn't get at least an A scaling. Now, it does get a D scaling in strength, so it's probably better to have with a quality-based build, but it's still a D scaling. It's not going to really carry you that far. So you'll notice that a lot of other katanas will end up out-damaging this thing. And as for its moveset, it's probably going to be the worst moveset out of all the other katanas. The one-handed version is like very similar to the Uchi katana, but it does get like the slower follow-up heavy attack. And as for the two-handed heavy attack, it does get like that downward vertical chop, which I'm not going to get into it again as to why I don't like vertical chops with the heavy attack. But yeah, outside of all that, it still serves as like a perfectly fine katana. I just wouldn't really bother going out of my way to try and acquire it, especially because you have to farm for it, which can be kind of annoying, and it does require Twinkling Titanites, which is much easier to upgrade a weapon that actually just uses regular Titanite, but it does look cool, I guess. Number 29, we have the Serpent Bone Blade, which honestly, there's not a single katana in this entire series that makes me more mad than this one. This thing should have been able to get infused, and for whatever reason, they just didn't want to like turn the button on to like let it be infused. I'm not sure if it's a bug or whatnot, and they just didn't get around to it. But yeah, this thing actually gets double slash as its weapon skill, which is not a unique skill, and it requires smithing stones. It requires smithing stones, and you can't infuse it. Why? It would have been so good if you could, because this weapon actually doesn't get bleed, it gets poison, but it doesn't get regular poison, it gets deadly poison, which is like a much better version of it. It ticks way faster, does way more damage, but it does only last 30 seconds, which is honestly a good thing because that means you can constantly keep the buffs active for the Mushroom Crown and the Kindred of Rot Exaltation, which this type of build is done extremely well with the Venomous Fang, another weapon that gets deadly poison and can be infused, because as it stands right now, you only get like 60 something poison buildup, which is going to take a very long time to proc the poison, which if you actually could infuse this and pair it alongside a Cult Infusion and go into Arcane, you could get way higher poison buildup. And this thing actually also does get a unique heavy attack as well. It's like some cool double slashing attack. Now in most cases I kind of do rather just have a regular poking attack for a heavy, but the fact that it's hitting multiple times in quick succession means it is pretty good at proccing status effects. But this same heavy attack kind of just makes the double slash weapon skill just useless, because you know you're getting a bunch of slashing attacks. They're both kind of the exact same thing. So if this thing could be infused, it would fix literally every problem that I have with it, and it would easily be top 10 on this list. Number 28, we have the Magic Sword Mikoto. Now, this is going to be the first Demon Souls katana we talk about. And Demon Souls katanas, they're pretty good. I just think for the most part that it's going to be outclassed by curve swords, because curve swords are also dexterity slashing type of weapons, and these are just going to be incredibly quick. Like curve swords are so fast, and they also do get bleed as well, but much like in Dark Souls 2, bleed is like a useless damage over time status effect that like almost every single enemy is just immune to. But as for the Mikoto in particular, this weapon actually does get the highest amount of base damage compared to all the other katanas, but the trade-off being is that it doesn't actually have any scalings, and all the other katanas can actually out damage the Mikoto at about like 25 dexterity. So this is going to be more of like an early game option, but unfortunately this thing is actually acquired after all the other katanas. You get this one last, so there's like not much of a point of actually using this thing. And it's like it has a different moveset as well, because all types of Demon Souls weapons have the exact same movesets. And also the Mikoto actually does drain your HP every second, so you just lose 1% HP, which is just like obviously not good. So there's too many downsides for this thing to actually be useful. Number 27, we have the Dark Souls 2 Washing Pole. Now, this one and the Dark Drift are just going to be like your PvP types of options, because in PvE, I wouldn't really bother using this thing much. Now, the Washing Pole is actually in every single Dark Souls game, and it is always going to be like the longest katana in the game, but there is always a drawback to these katanas. And for Dark Souls 2, it has just the most amount of drawbacks. Now, thankfully, damage isn't actually one of them. This thing actually can get more damage than most of the other katanas, and obviously combined with its amazing range, you might think that this is going to be like the obvious option, but unfortunately, this thing is actually going to be the the slowest katana. Its light attacks are just slower than like a regular one, like an Uchi katana. They also consume so much more stamina. Like I'm talking 30 to 40% more stamina with every single attack. Obviously, it's going to weigh more and have higher requirements compared to most others. It gets the lowest durability at 20 durability, meaning that against most bosses, you're probably going to have to use a repair powder or two. It also gets the lowest amount of counter damage out of all the katanas at 130, and even redirecting attacks and trying to move around while actually using the heavy attacks is actually a lot harder than it is compared to all the other katanas. So for me personally, I wouldn't really use this in PvE, but it still is a very large katana that does some very nice damage. Number 26, we have the Dark Souls 3 Chaos Blade. Now, katanas in Dark Souls 3, obviously they're going to be really good, but I just think they're just going to be outclassed by curved swords and straight swords. The R1 spamming potential on those weapons are just through the roof. They can output more DPS. They have horizontal swipes, meaning that it's better for hit detection because a lot of enemies in this game are pretty quick, and you tend to be surrounded by a whole bunch of trash mobs sometimes, and just having a horizontal swipes would just be better. But to be fair, there's not many things in this game that's going to be better than a straight sword. But as for the Chaos Blade though, just like it is in all the other Dark Souls games, it takes away your health with every single hit. And for this one in particular, it only drains 1% HP, which is like barely anything. It's not going to be that big of a deal. Now, the trade-off of you actually getting damaged while attacking is that you actually get really good scalings. You get an S scaling in dexterity, and at higher levels, you can definitely output more damage compared to all the other katanas. Unfortunately, you actually cannot buff this weapon, and buffs in this game are extremely good, so a lot of other katanas can just end up out damaging it, especially if you pair it alongside the Lloyd Sword Ring, because, you know, those katanas aren't going to make you take more damage just by attacking, and those katanas are going to get the exact same weapon art in hold, which this weapon art is actually really good. Having a nice quick horizontal swipe that can do high amounts of damage is very beneficial with the katana. And obviously part of the weapon art actually does let you parry as well, which parrying in this game is very easy to do, especially when you have this katana, you get plenty of frames. But I still wouldn't really want to use this katana over some of the other ones, but it still is going to be somewhat useful because you do get some nice damage without having to use buffs. You do get some of the highest blood loss build up compared to all the other katanas, and it does get some of the most range as well. It gets like the second most range next to the washing pole. So it does have its own uses, but it wouldn't be my first option. Number 25, we have the Dark Souls 2 Uchi Katana, which this is going to be your basic katana in the game. It does everything just very average, like average range, average damage. You get a pretty good moveset. You still get the same amount of like durability and counter damage and poise damage as all the other katanas. It's just going to be like the first one that you can acquire. So it's just good to have early game until you end up finding something better, of which I would just recommend switching to that. But honestly, this thing can carry you from start to finish with like little to no issues. Number 24, we have the Dark Souls 3 Uchi Katana. I feel the exact same way about this one as I do the Dark Souls 2 version. You can't really go wrong with this weapon. It's just going to be a good early game option. Until like later on in the game, they're going to be like better, higher damaging options, of which I just recommend switching to those instead. Honestly, I don't know which one I actually prefer out of the two Uchi Katanas. I probably should have put the Dark Souls 2 one a bit higher, because I think the Dark Souls 3 Uchi Katana is probably a little bit more outclassed. But either way, they're both amazing weapons. Number 23, we have the Elden Ring Dragon Scale Blade. Now, this katana actually doesn't get any status effect until after you use its weapon skill, of which it actually does get some more frost damage and actually give you 160 lightning damage too. Honestly, I wish it just kept its bleed. I don't really know why they got rid of the bleed. You could have had both frost and bloodlust build up and it wouldn't have been that broken, because it's not like it has an arcane scaling to where you can actually dramatically improve the bloodlust build up. It's just going to be like a stagnant amount. Now, obviously having frost is still going to be an amazing status effect to have. The fact that the weapon skill actually can be pretty high damaging and just give you a bunch more lightning damage is obviously very useful. This actually does do bonus damage towards dragons as well. But the reason that's why I'm going to put it lower on the list is because I think the dragon halberd is just going to outclass it. Obviously that's not a katana, but this weapon actually just gets the better weapon skill because you can buff it for cheaper. And if you do the entire combo, you can just do way more damage in the dragon scale blade. And also it gets like the better moveset because you just get a bunch of really good poking attacks. But yeah, for the dragon scale blade, Ice Lightning Sword, the weapon skill itself is just like a reskinned version of Lightning Slash. It's like a short range attack. It's not the quickest animation in the world. You don't really get much hyper armor either. I wish I just gave it like a different type of skill. I probably would have liked it more, but it's definitely not a bad weapon to have. Number 22, we have the Bloodlust, which is from Dark Souls 3. Now, this katana actually does get the least amount of damage compared to all the other katanas in this game until you actually use its weapon skill, which is also called Bloodlust. And this actually does, impale yourself, kind of like Seppuku from Elden Ring or the Lone Sword attack from Dark Souls 2. And after you stab yourself, you actually just boost your damage by 30%. And it also does give you 20 additional bleed, which obviously that's really good. It can end up being one of the better bleed weapons in the entire game, which bleed in this game is not the greatest, but it's still pretty decent. There are a fair share there are enemies that are weaker to it. And the 30% extra damage that it does get can make it go higher than most other weapons, albeit a lot of the other weapons can be buffed, so it's not like it's going to be the highest damaging one. But this extra blood loss build up they actually do get can actually scale with luck. So going into a bunch of luck could just further improve the blood loss build up, which is pretty nice. Although I would just kind of prioritize damage instead than it's going to dexterity. But the obvious downsides to this weapon is that you have to have the buff active for you to actually do this good damage and have this good blood loss build up. And the buff itself does only last 45 seconds. But in terms of actually using the weapon art, you actually don't do that much damage to yourself. It's kind of like the equivalent of doing like one light attack. It's a pretty quick animation, only consumes 10 FP. And you also get hyper armor throughout the animation to where you're not going to take as much damage. And funnily enough, you actually can do damage after you remove the blade out of your stomach. It actually does have a hitbox and actually can do some nice damage too. But the fact that this is actually taking up your weapon skill means that you don't get access to some of the other cool skills that the katanas get. Not having hold as a weapon art is going to be a downside because because hold is really good to have. It definitely enhances the katana moveset. Just having a quick horizontal swipe and the option to parry is very underrated. So this weapon does have its uses, but it's not going to be one of my top options. Number 21, we have the Black Steel Katana from Dark Souls 2. Now, this is like where we get into like the really good territory of katanas because all of these perform very well. And for the Black Steel Katana, this is probably my favorite katana in the game because the two-handed moveset is just the best one out of all the katanas. It's like very reminiscent of the Iato with that heavy attack that it gets. But the follow-up is actually going to be a poke, and just constantly spamming the heavy attack is just really good. Now, it's not going to be the most unique thing because like every other katana where there's like one-handed moveset also gets a poking attack into a horizontal swipe, but it just does it like the reverse way. But the reason as to why I'm not going to put the Black Steel Katana higher on the list is because it just lacks the damage. It does get really good scalings, but its base damage is that low that the good scalings just don't really make up for it. Even at very high levels, it still performs worse than like almost all the other katanas in the game in terms of damage. And although the moveset is really good, it's not that much better to where I can put it higher on the list. Number 20, we have the Elden Ring Katana. Now, this is one of two katanas in this game that can be infused, and any weapon in this game that can be infused is automatically just made very viable. And if you're a weapon that does bleed and can be infused and buffed, you have like one of the best weapons in the entire game, especially if you're a katana, because you get some of the best Ashavor options. You get really good infusions like Keen or Occult infusions to either improve your blood loss put up and to improve your damage. And even if you go with the infusion to improve your damage, you can pair it alongside Blood Flame Blade to just further improve your blood loss build up. So yeah, blade-based builds are just going to be broken in this game, and katanas can do it some of the best. Now, the reason why the Katana is still not going to get that high on the list is because there's very few circumstances of which I would use this thing over the Nagakiba, because the Nagakiba gets like twice as much range, the better moveset, and it gets very similar damage. Some infusions, the Nagakiba can actually outperform the Katana, but with like most elemental infusions, you're probably better off going with the Katana instead in terms of just maximizing your damage output, because one, it is going to be a lighter weapon, it is going to have less requirements. So if you actually want to go all into like a faith or intelligence build and have like a certain type of infusion for this thing, you don't have to spec into much strength and intelligence, whereas you kind of have to if you have the Nagakiba. So for me, that's going to be like its only use that it has. Or if you actually wanted to power stand something alongside the Nagakiba, you could just put this one in your offhand, because I'm pretty sure I think you can only get one Nagakiba per playthrough. So it is like a very good weapon, but it doesn't have that many uses. Number 19, we have the Dark Souls 1 Chaos Blade. Now, this is actually the first Dark Souls 1 weapon that is going to make an appearance onto this list, and Dark Souls 1 katanas are just incredible. Really nice range, good damage, pretty decent speeds, bleed is very useful in this game. But as for the Chaos Blade in particular, this one actually does get the highest amount of base damage. It doesn't really get like the best dexterity scaling, it's only a base scaling and dexterity, but it also does scale off your humanity stat, and having 10 humanity could just further improve the damage, and you can just definitely output more damage than all the other katanas in the game. But there are going to be reasons as to why this is going to get at the bottom of the Dark Souls 1 katanas list, and that's one, it can't be buffed or infused. Even when you have 10 humanity, it only gets like a little bit more damage than like an Katana or Iato at like 40 dexterity. And those things can actually be buffed to just further improve the damage. And also, just like all the other Chaos Blades, you just take damage every single time that you actually hit something, which is like 20 HP for every single hit, which is not that much, but the fact that you're still taking damage isn't going to be the greatest thing. And also, it just gets the worst moveset in my opinion. The heavy attack does that stupid vertical slam that I just do not like. I hate those stupid vertical attacks. Just give me a poke and a horizontal swipe. It's going to enhance the moveset so much more. But obviously, the damage output is still going to be very good, and you don't have to actually use a buff to actually get there also. But the fact that you have to spec into a lot of humanity and have to take damage every single time that you do hit something kind of hurts its usefulness. The Rivers of Blood, the infamous Rivers of Blood. Yeah, this thing got nerfed like way too hard in my opinion. Honestly, I don't really care that it got nerfed pretty hard. We saw this thing like every single day and everybody used it. It was never really like the best weapon in the entire game, but it was incredibly easy to use. But yes, this is going to be a dexterity and arcane based katana. Does get some split fire damage, also gets some pretty high AR. But yeah, its weapon skill is going to be Corpse Piler, of which this thing is just like a reskinned version of double slash. But the difference is that it consumes more FP, like much more FP. But the trade-off is that it actually gets like an extended projectile part that can hit like 3 times the distance of like a regular katana, which obviously is incredibly useful. Having like a projectile that can just do blood loss split up in quick succession for not much FP and also do damage in the meantime too is pretty useful. It's not going to stagger like most enemies in the game, but against like smaller ones, it can stagger them nicely. But that same projectile part is actually what got nerfed. So it's more like just doing like chip damage at a distance, because the bulk of the damage is going to be coming at point blank range, of which you could just use like a Nagakiba or an Uchigatana with double slash with an occult infusion, and that will just be doing more blood loss put up and more damage for a third of the FP cost as well. And you get those things like much earlier in the game. So Rivers of Blood is not going to have that much of a use anymore. Number 17, we have the Dark Souls 1 Uchigatana, which this is going to be your starting katana in the game, just like all the other Uchigatanas. And this one actually does get the highest amount of damage compared to all the other katanas. That is actually if you include buffs. Now, it's not going to be by much. The Washing Pole and the Yato get like almost just as much damage, but I'm still going to prefer those 2 katanas a bit more for reasons I'll actually end up getting into. But yeah, this katana is like just as good as those ones, honestly. It's like not that much of a difference. But the only reason it gets this low is because I think it's just outclassed by the other 2. But that's kind of just more subjective as well. Number 16, we have the Black Blade from Dark Souls 3. Now, this bad boy actually is the highest damage katana in the entire game. Gets really good base damage, pretty decent scalings too. Also does get a unique heavy attack, both one-handed and two-handed. The one-handed version actually does serve as a horizontal swipe, which actually is pretty good, and it does combo into a poking attack, so you actually still get access to both horizontal swipes and poking attacks, which is the same as like the regular katana moveset. It's just like reversed. Instead of starting off with a poking attack, it starts off with the horizontal swipe, which in this game can actually still be pretty useful because there's plenty of times which it gets ganked by a bunch of enemies, and having the horizontal swipe can be pretty nice. But the weapon skill already does that with hold. That weapon skill already gets a horizontal swipe, so it kind of just doesn't make it as useful. And as for the two-handed heavy attack, it does like that same stupid downward slam heavy attack that the Chaos Blade gets from Dark Souls 1, but two-handed heavy attacks already get vertical swipes anyway, so it's not that big of a difference. But the main reason as to why it's not going to get much higher in the list despite it getting the highest amount of damage is because it's so incredibly short. It is the shortest katana in the entire game. There are like straight swords that have more range than this thing. It is just ridiculous. So for me personally, I would never really want to use it due to its very poor range. But if range isn't that big of a deal, then you could just go with the Black Blade because it just does the most damage. The Hand of Millennia, which this katana should be a lot better than what it is, but it still is really good. Now, starting off with the fact this actually has the second most range out of all the katanas, does get a nice dexterity scaling. You can actually output some nice amounts of damage, and its weapon skill, Waterfowl Dance, is very cheap for how much damage that it actually can do, and actually does perform especially well against larger bosses, and against smaller ones, it actually can stun lock them pretty nicely. Now, this is not going to be without some downsides. There are plenty of downsides with this weapon. One, it only gets a dexterity scaling, no arcane scaling, meaning that you really can't improve that blood loss build up. Only having like 50 blood loss build up is just not that good. Even with the weapon skill, it's not going to proc bleed that quickly. Two, it has a very high dexterity requirement at 48 dexterity, which by the time that you do get this weapon, you probably should be at that level anyway. But for having such a high dexterity requirement, you'd think it'd have like an S scaling in dexterity, but it doesn't. And in terms of its weapon skill, Waterfowl Dance, as I talked about, high damaging, very cheap, it can stun lock enemies, but the stamina cost is extremely high. Like the entire combo will just drain your entire stamina bar. You get no hyper armor while you're airborne, so every single hit, you're just gonna get staggered right out of it and fall straight to the ground. You can't actually delay the input if you actually want to do the follow-up. You actually have to constantly keep spamming it, which is probably like the most annoying thing about this. And honestly, for how you actually acquire this weapon, it should be way better than what it is. You get it like the last area in the game, behind an optional area, behind another optional area of like the most bullshit boss they probably ever made. This thing should be doing more damage, not consume as much stamina, probably even give you like health regen on hits. This thing should be like one of the best weapons in Elden Ring, but it's just not. It's a good weapon, but it's just not that good. Number 14, we have the Demon Souls Uchigatana. This is going to be the last Uchigatana we talk about. And the reason why I value this one more than the other Uchigatanas is because this is like the only one in Demon Souls that doesn't drain your health. So like instantly, it is going to be pretty useful. It's not going to be the highest damage katana, but it still is a katana. So it's still going to get some nice damage. Still going to have the same moveset as all the other katanas, but it just doesn't drain your health. So yeah, it's pretty useful. Number 13, we have the Dark Souls 3 Washing Pole, which this weapon is the same as all the other Washing Poles in that it gets the most amount of range in the game. And for Dark Souls 3 Washing Pole, it actually gets some of the highest damage too. It gets like the second most damage out of all the katanas, which that combined with its amazing range obviously is a pretty good pairing. Now, just like all the other Washing Poles, there is going to be some downsides outside of the fact that it actually does have higher requirements and actually weigh a bit more. It does consume a bit more stamina, which is not going to be as much as like the Dark Souls 2 washing pole, but it is still going to be like a little bit more. And it also consumes more FP with its weapon art. It's the exact same weapon art as the other katanas in Hold, same attack, same parry and things like that, but it just consumes 5 more FP for whatever reason. Number 12, we have the Bewitched Alone Sword. Now, this weapon is literally the only katana in the entire series that actually gets a unique light attack combo. Like, not including power stancing, this is basically the only one. Because obviously, this is not like your average katana. It's like a big boy type of katana. Honestly, has like more range than the washing pole. But funnily enough, it actually consumes less stamina. But this thing just also gets the most amount of damage too. Very nice base damage. You get an S scaling and dexterity. Now, the trade-off being is that the light attack combo is slower. It kind of has like more diagonal types of swipes. But the heavy attack is very similar to what you get with like all the other katanas. Actually says the exact same one as the Berserker Blade. And the speed of this heavy attack is basically the exact same. So you can just honestly constantly spam the heavy attack and its output more damage than like all the other katanas. But another unique thing about this katana is that it actually is the only one that does get bleed, which yes, bleed kind of is shitty in this game. It doesn't really do much. A lot of enemies are just immune to it as well. But the fact that it does get bleed is obviously going to be a plus. But this weapon also does get the unique benefit of being able to get buffed with its parrying attack, of which the buff is kind of just going to be like seppuku, which this buff obviously like impales yourself seppuku style and just adds some more blood loss build up and just some more damage, and also does extend the range by a little bit. Now the extended part of the buff is just going to be doing like a little bit of damage. It's not like that increased range improves the damage by so much, but the fact that you actually can extend the range even more is already insane. And you also can power stance this bad boy too, and have both of the weapons just be buffed, and the power stancing combos swing just as fast as like all the other katanas. So yeah, this weapon literally gets the most amount of damage and actually has the most amount of range too, but there are going to be some downsides. Obviously the fact that you have to stab yourself to just buff the weapon every single time, meaning you're taking a bunch of damage, and it does only last 30 seconds. Also, this weapon does get a pretty high strength requirements despite it actually not scaling in strength at all. You have to go spec into 22 strength, and if you want a power stance, you have to spec into more strength. But for me, the worst thing about this weapon is going to be its durability. It gets 20 durability, which is tied for the least amount out of all the other katanas. So you're going to have to stack up on a bunch of repair powders because this thing will break in a boss fight. Number 11, we have the Dark Souls 1 washing pole, the last washing pole we're going to talk about, and of which this one is like the same as all the other washing poles. It's just like a very long Uchi katana. Same moveset, very similar damage. Now for the Dark Souls 1 washing pole, this one actually does get a little bit slower of a moveset. It's not that noticeable, but it still is a little bit slower. And also, once again, the stamina cost is going to be a bit higher. But obviously that extended range makes it incredibly good, and katanas in this game are just always going to be amazing. Now I did mention that the Uchi katana actually does get more damage, but the washing pole can honestly get almost just as much, and sometimes even more, because this washing pole is better with a quality-based infusion, whereas the other katanas are just more for dexterity. So if you're just going into a bunch of strength and dexterity, this thing can actually output more damage than all the other katanas, and obviously just do it at like a much longer distance. So yeah, for me, the fact that it's actually going to be doing like very similar damage, but just have more range, I'm just going to prefer the washing pole. Number 10, we have the Hiltless, which is probably the best katana in Demon Souls. This thing just outputs the most amount of damage, has a very good dexterity scaling, has the exact same moveset and very similar range as all the other Demon Souls katanas too. But the major drawback is that this thing actually does drain your health with every single hit. Very similar to the Chaos Blade, except this one actually drains 3% HP for every single hit, which is a pretty decent amount. So you can counteract it with the Regenerator's Ring, and then it probably wouldn't be too bad, but it is a very necessary drawback because the Hiltless can actually output so much damage. Now, once again, I probably don't really prefer katanas over curved swords in this game because they both get bleed, but the curved swords are just going to get higher DPS with their insanely fast light attack combos. But katanas are still going to have their uses because they have more range and actually get more variety with their moveset too. Number 9, we have the Frayed Blade, which this weapon is actually the lowest damaging weapon in the entire game. Gets pretty poor AR. You get split dark damage, means that you can't buff it, and dark damage is like the worst damage type in the entire game. You get very low durability, like this thing will just break very quickly against certain types of boss fights. It also gets the highest dexterity requirement too at 40 dexterity, but its weapon art is just going to be good enough to just propel it to the top 10, because its weapon art also goes into a stance like the other types of katanas, but you just get the option of a projectile attack, which doesn't go that far, but the fact that you can just get a projectile is always going to be pretty good. Does do some nice damage as well. Or better yet, you could just use the flurry attack, which can stun lock smaller types of enemies and just proc bleed incredibly quickly. Now it is going to be like a longer animation that you probably can get staggered out of. And honestly, the regular weapon art attack that you actually get with the other katanas in that quick sideward swipe can honestly do just as much damage in like half the time. But the thing that makes the Frayed Blade so good is that you can spam it over and over again. With the other katana weapon skills, you have to wait for the animation to finish, and then you have to repeat it all over again. But for this one, you can just constantly keep clicking the buttons and you can go back and forth between both versions of the weapon art. Now, obviously it's probably going to be a bit more situational. There's not many bosses out there that would like let you have an opening for that long. But if you do, it can just be absolutely devastating. Of which I just prefer to have the flurry attack over and over again. I would only really use the projectile version if they just end up going at a distance, because that flurry attack can just proc bleed so quickly, and it only consumes 11 FP, and the stamina cost isn't even that high as well. You can like use it like 4 or 5 times before you even run out of stamina. So against any enemy that actually can be bled out, this thing can just cheese them, especially if you actually go spec into the luck stat, which I probably don't really recommend. I just rather just go into damage, because there's not many bosses in this game that are wicked to bleed. So yeah, despite a plethora of downsides, it still ends up being one of the best katanas in the entire series. Number 8, we have the Manslayer from Dark Souls 2. This thing is basically just an Uchi Katana, but it just gets more damage and it gets poison. That's basically all that you gotta know, because poison in this game is just absolutely ridiculous. It just melts and shreds enemies' health bars, and the fact that you can just do it with a katana is just going to be incredible, because they obviously get really good movesets, really high counter damage, some nice range. The power sensing moveset's pretty good too. The only downside that I can say about the Manslayer is that it is on the shorter side, but being that it actually is short, it actually does consume less stamina than like all the other katanas in the game, and where there's really good dexterity scaling and higher base damage, it can end up being like top 3 katana in this game in terms of damage. So yeah, I think the Manslayer is one of the best katanas in Dark Souls 2. Number 7, we have the Onikiri and Ubidachi from Dark Souls 3. And honestly, every single power stancing Dark Souls 3 weapon is just amazing. I don't know what they do with these things, but they just output so much damage so quickly. So yeah, this thing's moveset is actually extremely good. It's multiple times in quick succession, meaning that you actually can stunlock enemies very quickly, because like nothing in this game actually has poise. And being that this weapon is actually doing bleed, it can actually proc bleed quicker than like almost anything else in the entire game. Especially because you can actually buff and infuse it, so you can either pair it alongside Karthus Rouge or have a hollow infusion and go into luck. And this weapon also does get a unique weapon art in Oni Slayer. You kind of just like jump up in the air and this awesome attack that you gets a bunch of hyper armor. You're not really going to get staggered out of it much. And it does like stun lock enemies. Now this attack is not going to get like the most amount of damage, so I wouldn't really use it against boss fights. But if you're fighting like a Silver Knight or a Lothric Knight, these things can make very quick work of them, and it can definitely make those encounters incredibly easy. Now in terms of the downsides of this weapon, there isn't really much. Like, it is going to be on the heavier side. It does actually have higher requirements. The power sensing weapon that you have in the offhand is going to be like a smaller katana, so sometimes you actually might just end up missing. But it is going to be very few downsides for an overall amazing weapon. Number 6, we have the Iato, to what I consider the best katana in Dark Souls 1. This thing is basically the exact same thing as the Uchi Katana in terms of like range and damage. It's like very slightly less damage. But in my opinion, it just gets the better movesets, both one-handed and two-handed, because it gives you access to a horizontal swipe. Those horizontal swipes are so nice. They cover so much distance because you get a nice lunge. They can do some nice damage. And obviously horizontal swipes means that you can actually hit multiple enemies at once. And it's better for hit detection too. Certain types of enemies could like easily dodge like those vertical types of swipes, especially like with the clunkiness of Dark Souls 1. Now the only unfortunate thing I can say about the Iato is that you don't get like a standstill poking attack like you do with a one-handed Uchi Katana. But obviously you still get poking attacks with like its backstep and running attack, of which I didn't really talk about katana running attacks because there's not really much of a need to, as like every single katana running attack is just incredibly good. It's probably like just the best running attack in like Souls history, honestly. Number 5, we have the Dark Souls 2 Chaos Blade, to what I consider the best katana in Dark Souls 2. This thing just outputs so much damage, just like all the other Chaos Blades do across the games. But the difference is that in Dark Souls 2, like everything can be buffed and infused. But not only does it get like the highest amount of AR, but you also get the highest counter damage at 160. All the other katanas get about like 130 or 150. And being that enemies are kind of just always attacking, you're kind of just always just doing more damage. And this weapon also does get some of the best katana movesets too. The one-handed, you still get that same poking attack. And two-handed, you actually do get a nice horizontal swipe. Unfortunately, the follow-up attack is not a poke and it gets that stupid downward slam. But having like a standstill horizontal swipe and a standstill poking attack is obviously going to be really good. Now, yes, just like all the other Chaos Blades, you are going to take damage every single time that you hit something, of which this one is going to be 50 HP, which might be a pretty big deal early game, but once you get like later into the playthrough, it is not going to be that big of a deal, especially because there's plenty of things that can actually help regenerate your HP. But yeah, S-scaling and dexterity, good moveset, 160 counter damage. That's all that you got to know really. Number 4, we have the Chikage, the lone katana in Bloodborne, and I know people are already going to be commenting, oh, how is a Bloodborne weapon not going to get number 1? Bloodborne weapons are so much better than everything else. And that's because if you weren't paying attention to the intro or anything else I've been saying, it's based on how useful the weapon is in its own game, of which the Chikage is going to be an amazing weapon in Bloodborne, but I don't think it's like top 5 or top 3. But yeah, to talk about it itself, it has an amazing moveset, so you get good variety, nice vertical, horizontal poking attacks. You do get a nice skill scaling, so that untransformed version can actually perform pretty well, but the transformed version is where it's at, because it basically like dips it in a bunch of blood, of which you get an S scaling and blood tinge. And yes, it actually does drain your HP, but it's like less than 1% HP per second. And in a fast-paced game like Bloodborne that has like 20 blood vials, it's not that big of a deal, especially because you just do so much damage. Like, look at this shit. It can just melt everything in the entire game, especially with those charged heavy attacks, which yes, also is going to make it consume more HP. But like, look at the damage. It can like send enemies flying, flatten them to the ground, take off a whole chunk of health, lunge pretty far, and like it does it in like an instant. Like, it's really good. Like, the only downsides that I could say about the Chikage, outside of obviously like losing your health, is that's like farm the blood gems can be like super like mega cringe, but that's only if you want like the 30% gems, because like 20% gems are perfectly fine. The gameplay that you're seeing right now, these are just 20% gems and it's still doing this much damage. So it is actually hard to compare, you know, the Chikage to like all the other Souls types of katanas, but it definitely still is going to be one of the better ones they've ever made. Number 3, we have the Moonveil from Elden Ring. Yeah, like katanas in this game are just always going to be really good because they just get bleed, and then the weapon skills are always going to be really good because they're just always higher damaging, and yeah, the Moonveil is just like both of those things. This thing gets really good scalings. You get a B scaling in both intelligence and dexterity. You just get like the basic regular katana moveset where there's like nothing really bad that you can say about it. But yeah, its weapon skill, Transient's Moonlight, is just like a reskinned version of Unsheath. And Unsheath is like already one of the best weapon skills in the entire game. It's so fast, cheap, does high damage. It also does a very high stance damage. Like, being able to do high stance damage with a katana is just stupid. Like, it should not be allowed. But it is, and now we just gotta live with it. But Transient's Moonlight basically takes Unsheath and turns it into a projectile attack. And this projectile attack does magic damage, of which there's like 1,000 different things in this game that can just boost this weapon skill. And the projectile comes out like in an instant. Like, the only drawback is that it consumes like a little bit more FP, but like it's not that much more FP, like 20 and 15 FP respectively. That's like nothing. And it does like this much damage, like at a distance. And if you were to use it at point blank range, it would just do even more damage because the weapon has a hitbox. And if you hit him with the weapon directly, you're also proccing bleed too. So yeah, like this weapon is like one of the easiest weapons to use in the entire game. Number 2, we have the Nagakiba, which is another Elden Ring katana, of which this one is like an ode to the washing pole from the previous games. And as I mentioned with the washing pole, it's just always going to be like the longest range katana in the entire game, but it always has like some downsides, of which the Nagakiba just doesn't have any downsides. There's like no drawbacks for it just having this much range. It just basically just gets this much range for free. It gets like just as much damage as the Uchi katana, sometimes even more damage. You also get the Nagakiba just as early as you can get the Uchi katana, and probably best of all yet, it actually just gets the better moveset. You get poking attacks all throughout the moveset. You get no stupid vertical swipes with a heavy attack. Both one-handed, two-handed, nothing but poking attacks, and combined with its stupid range, it can trivialize so many enemies. And obviously piercing damage is like the best damage type in this entire game. So you're gonna go ahead and just spec around that and just go spam charged heavy attacks, and you have a build already like that. Now, like the only downsides that you could say about the Nagakiba is that it does like weigh a little bit more than the Uchi katana, but like it's by like 1 unit and it's still not even the heaviest katana. It also does get like a slight bit higher strength requirement, but like none of that matters because katanas are just always going to be amazing, especially the ones that you can infuse, because they get passive bleed, and bleed in this game is just an absolute menace. They can just shred everything. All bosses can just be deleted. Lots of enemies are weaker to it, and having a weapon that does have passive bleed, which means you can pair it alongside Blood Flame Blade to proc bleed even quicker, or have an arcane based build with an occult infusion, and you can infuse it with different types of weapon skills that could also just cheese the game. Unsheath is so fast, does high damage, really cheap, high stance damage too. You could put double slash on this thing to just get a better version of the Rivers of Blood. You could put Blood Blade on this weapon to just get a better version than the Reduvia. Like, just having the Nagakiba with Blood Blade in itself is already like one of the best weapons in the entire game, because this thing could just do more damage than Reduvia, more stance damage, much more blood loss build up, half the FP, half the stamina cost, and even if you're including the Ritual Sword Talisman that you'll probably end up losing because Bloodblade does decrease your HP, but only for like the first part of the animation. Every successive cast with Bloodblade doesn't consume any. It's still going to be doing way more damage, and being that it actually has a hitbox with the weapon itself, you can use it at point blank range, and as you can see, things are just getting destroyed. But you can actually infuse this thing with more weapon skills, like different types of ones. For any single circumstance, you just got a weapon skill that can just destroy the game. And the Nagakiba can just do it extremely well because it just gets amazing range. You get all like the quick based weapon skills with a weapon that has just as much range as a spear. Like, what? That's insane. Number 1, we have the Kusabi-Maru and the Mortal Blade. I'm just going to put both of these things onto the list because if I didn't, everyone was going to be talking about in the comment section, oh, what about the Kusabi-Maru? What about Sekiro, huh? What about the Sekiro stuff? Here you go, you get it. Okay, stop making the stupid same joke every single time that I make these videos. But yeah, the Kusabi-Maru is going to be the best katana because it's like basically the only one. The Mortal Blade is not a katana. It's just a combat art. The game doesn't classify it as such. I don't know why they didn't want to give us like another katana. Like there wouldn't have been anything broken about having like another katana with like a slightly different light attack combo. That probably would have been somewhat cool, but that's a conversation for another day. But yeah, the Kusabi-Maru is just going to be the best one because yeah, it's the only one. So therefore it is in fact the most useful katana. Anyway, that is in fact the list. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below, and do like and subscribe because I do have some more videos coming along the way. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.